Story 1. The third night was different. I ended up moving out of that house less than 3 months after I bought it. Whenever people ask why, I usually give them a simple answer. I tell them the place had too many problems, electrical issues, plumbing issues, kind of excuses people accept without asking questions. The truth is harder to explain. It started with knocking, not loud banging, not someone trying to force their way inside. Just 3 slow knocks that always came at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. The first time it happened, I thought it was a neighbor. Second time, I assumed it was some kid playing a stupid prank. By the third night, I wasn't so sure. I remember lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't sleep that night. There was no particular reason. Sometimes my mind just refused to shut off. The house was completely silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Then I looked at the clock. 1:59 a.m. For some reason, seeing that time made me think about the previous 2 nights. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Then the knocking came. 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. The sound drifted through the house so clearly that I felt my stomach tighten. I sat upright immediately. For several seconds I didn't move, just listened. Nothing. The silence that followed felt even worse than the knocking itself. Finally, I got out of bed and walked toward the window beside my dresser. The front yard was illuminated by a streetlight across the road. Most of the property was covered in shadows, but I could still see the porch. At first, I thought the porch was empty. Then I noticed something standing near the bottom of the steps. A person. At least, I think it was a person. The figure was completely still. No movement, no shifting weight, no pacing. Just standing there. I remember leaning closer to the glass, trying to make out details. The distance wasn't far, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything except the outline. I couldn't see a face, couldn't see clothing, just a tall dark shape facing the house, waiting. The longer I stared, the more uncomfortable I became. Most people, if they knock on a door, expect someone to answer. They wave, they call out, they check their phone. This figure did none of those things. It simply stood there. After what felt like several minutes, I stepped away from the window to grab my phone. When I looked back, the porch was empty. The figure was gone. No footsteps, no car engine, nothing. Just an empty yard and a silence that somehow felt different than before. At the time, I thought the mystery would eventually make sense. I had no idea that night was only the beginning. It started like nothing looking back now. The strange part isn't how it ended. The strange part is how normal everything felt at the beginning. The house was located in a small neighborhood on the edge of town. It wasn't isolated enough to feel remote, but it was far enough from busy roads that nights were usually quiet. That was one of the reasons I bought it. I had spent years living in apartments where I could hear neighbors arguing through thin walls or cars passing outside at all hours. The house felt like a fresh start, was modest, affordable, and sat on a corner lot with a small front yard and a wooden fence around the backyard. For the first couple of weeks, nothing seemed unusual. I unpacked boxes, painted a few rooms, and settled into a routine. Most evenings were uneventful. I'd get home from work, make dinner, watch television for a while, and head to bed. The neighborhood seemed friendly enough. I waved to people walking their dogs. A retired couple lived across the street. Another family lived 2 houses down. Everyone appeared normal. That's why I didn't think much about the first knock. Happened exactly 1 week after I moved in. The time I didn't know the hour mattered. I woke suddenly to 3 knocks somewhere in the house. Knock, 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 half asleep. I checked my phone. 2 a.m. I remember feeling annoyed more than concerned. Someone was probably at the wrong address. Maybe a teenager was playing a prank. Maybe one of the neighbors needed help. I waited for another knock, but none came. After a minute or two, I got up and looked through the front window. Nobody was there. The street was empty. Stood there for a few seconds before returning to bed and forgetting about it. The next morning, the incident already felt insignificant. Then it happened again. The following night, the exact same time. The exact same pattern. 3 slow knocks. When I checked my phone, it read 2 a.m. That got my attention. Not because I was scared, but because it seemed oddly deliberate. It's time I went outside. The night air was cool and still. The neighborhood looked completely asleep. Porch lights were off. No cars moved through the street. I walked around the front yard with my phone flashlight. Nothing. No person, no vehicle, no sign that anyone had been there. The whole thing felt ridiculous. The next afternoon, I casually mentioned it to the retired couple across the street while checking my mailbox. They exchanged confused looks. Neither of them had heard any knocking. In fact, they claimed they hadn't heard anything unusual at all during either night. I laughed it off, but something about their response bothered me. Sound carried easily in that neighborhood. 3 knocks loud enough to wake me should have been noticeable to someone else. Over the next few days, small things started catching my attention. One morning, I noticed muddy footprints near the mailbox. Only a few, not enough to prove anything. I assumed they belonged to a delivery driver. Yet they seemed oddly placed, as if someone had been standing there rather than walking past. Another evening, I found the backyard gate hanging open. I clearly remembered latching it earlier that day. Again, there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The worst moment happened while taking out the trash. I was dragging the bin toward the curb just after sunset when a sudden feeling stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't movement. It was the unmistakable sensation that someone was watching me. I turned immediately. The street behind me was empty. The neighboring yards were empty. No people, no vehicles, nothing. Yet the feeling lingered for several seconds before finally fading. I remember standing there in the growing darkness, staring down the quiet street. For the first time since moving in, the neighborhood didn't feel welcoming. It felt like something was waiting. Less than 24 hours later, the knocking returned. Watching the porch after the 3rd night, I stopped treating the knocking like a random annoyance. I became fixated on it. At first, I told myself I just wanted an explanation. There had to be one. Every strange thing that had happened so far could be explained on its own. Footprints near the mailbox, the open gate, the feeling of being watched. None of it was proof of anything. But the knocking was different. Timing was too exact. Every night, exactly 2 a.m. Not 1:58, not 2:03. Always 2 o'clock. I spent the next day thinking about it at work. Instead of focusing on emails and meetings, I found myself replaying the previous nights over and over. By evening, I had made up my mind. If someone was responsible, I was going to catch them. That night, I stayed awake. At 1:45 a.m., I turned off every light in the house and sat in a chair near the front window. The television was off. My phone was on silent. The neighborhood outside was dark and still. Occasionally, a distant car would pass somewhere beyond the subdivision, but otherwise, everything remained quiet. I watched the front yard, the mailbox, the sidewalk, the porch. Nothing moved. Every few minutes, I checked the time. 1:52, 1:56, 1:58. As 2 o'clock approached, I felt my pulse beginning to quicken. I remember feeling embarrassed by it. I was sitting alone in my own house, waiting for a noise, yet something deep down told me it was coming. Then the clock changed. 2 a.m. Knock, knock, knock. The sound hit me like ice water. Even though I had been expecting it, hearing it in the darkness felt completely different. I jumped from the chair and rushed to the window. The porch was empty. No person, no movement, nothing. I stood there staring, confused. The knocks had sounded close. Close enough that whoever made them should have still been visible. Then I heard something else. Footsteps. My entire body tensed. The sound came from outside. Slow footsteps moving along the side of the house. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The noise was faint but unmistakable. Someone was walking through the gravel path that ran between my house and the fence. I grabbed my phone and hurried toward the kitchen window that overlooked the side yard. By the time I got there, the footsteps had stopped. The darkness outside looked perfectly still. I switched on the flashlight and stepped into the backyard. The beams swept across the fence line. Nothing. The gate was closed. The grass moved slightly in the breeze. Otherwise, the yard was empty. I checked every corner. Behind the shed, near the fence, around the side path. Nobody. The whole search took less than 2 minutes. Whoever had been there should not have had enough time to disappear. I went back inside feeling unsettled, but also determined. The following night I tried again. This time I positioned myself upstairs where I could watch both the front yard and part of the driveway. At 2 a.m., the knocking returned. 3 slow knocks, exactly the same. Again, I rushed to the window. Again, nobody stood on the porch. And once again, only seconds later, I heard footsteps moving along the side of the house. The pattern repeated the next night, and the night after that. Every time the same sequence unfolded: knocking, silence, footsteps, nothing. What disturbed me most wasn't that someone seemed to be there. It was how carefully they avoided being seen. It felt intentional, as though whoever was outside knew exactly where I was standing, as though they knew precisely how long it would take me to reach each window. The feeling followed me through the rest of the week. Even during the daytime, I caught myself glancing toward the front yard, checking the porch, looking through windows, waiting. Because by then, I was no longer trying to prove that something strange was happening. I was trying to figure out why it felt like someone was studying me from outside the house. The camera footage, by the end of that week, I was exhausted. The lack of sleep was starting to catch up with me. Every night I stayed awake waiting for the knocking. Every morning I woke up feeling frustrated because I was no closer to understanding what was happening. The worst part was knowing that someone seemed to be out there while having no proof. I needed evidence. So that weekend, I bought a security camera system. Nothing expensive. Just a set of outdoor cameras that connected to an app on my phone. I installed one above the front door, another facing the driveway, and a third covering the side yard where I kept hearing the footsteps. For the first time since the knocking began, I felt optimistic. If someone was visiting my property every night, the cameras would catch them. At least, that was what I thought. The first night after installing them, I sat in bed watching the live feeds on my phone. Everything looked normal. Front porch remained empty. The driveway was clear. The side yard showed nothing except the fence and a patch of gravel illuminated by a small security light. I watched until nearly 2 a.m. Then the live feed froze. At first I assumed it was my internet connection. The image on every camera stopped updating at exactly the same moment. I frowned and checked the signal status. Disconnected. A few seconds later, the feeds turned, connected. Everything looked normal again. Then I noticed the time. 2:01 a.m. And right on schedule, 3 knocks echoed through the house. Knock, knock, knock. I rushed to the window. Nobody was there. The cameras hadn't captured anything. Connection had dropped only moments before the knocking occurred. I told myself it was probably a coincidence. But the next night, it happened again. At 1:59 a.m., the cameras disconnected. At 2 a.m., the knocking happened. By 2:01 a.m., the feeds returned. The pattern repeated for 3 consecutive nights. Every single time. The timing was so precise that it stopped feeling random. I began reviewing the recordings frame by frame. Hours of footage, night after night, looking for anything unusual. Most of it showed absolutely nothing. Empty yards, silent streets, motionless shadows. Then, on the 6th night, I found something. It wasn't a video. It was a single frame. One frame captured immediately before the signal disappeared. I almost missed it. The image showed my front porch. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Then I zoomed in. My stomach dropped. Someone was standing in front of the door, not near the door, not approaching the door, standing directly in front of it, closer than seemed possible. The figure was so close that only part of its body appeared in the frame. A shoulder, part of an arm, a dark shape where a head should have been. The image quality was terrible, but there was no doubt something was there. I stared at the frame for nearly an hour, trying to understand what I was looking at. What bothered me wasn't the figure itself, it was the timing. That image had been recorded seconds before the signal disappeared. Seconds before the knocking. Seconds before I checked the window and found nobody outside. Whoever it was had been right there. Close enough to touch my front door, yet somehow gone by the time I looked. Over the next several nights, I became obsessed with catching a clearer image. Each evening I adjusted camera angles. I tested settings. I checked connections. I even upgraded my internet service. Nothing changed. Every night the cameras failed at the same moment. Every morning I found myself searching through recordings, convinced that answers were hiding somewhere inside them. Then came the night that bothered me most. The signal returned a few seconds earlier than usual. just enough to record a brief clip after the knocking. When I reviewed it the next day, I felt a chill run through me. The camera showed the empty porch. Then, at the very edge of the frame, a dark figure moved out of view, not toward the house, away from it. I checked the timestamp. I had reached the front window only 4 seconds later. 4 seconds. That was the closest I had ever come to seeing whoever or whatever was visiting my house. Somehow, once again, I had missed them. The last knock the final night began differently. By then I was tired of watching through windows and reviewing recordings. Every attempt to understand what was happening had only created more questions. The cameras provided evidence that someone had been there, yet they never showed enough to explain who it was or how they kept disappearing. Part of me wanted to leave the house. Another part wanted answers. That night, I decided I wasn't going to run upstairs after the knocking. I wasn't going to stare through curtains or rush between windows. I was going to stay by the front door. At around 1:30 a.m., I turned off the lights downstairs and sat in a chair facing the entrance. The security cameras were recording. My phone rested on the table beside me. The house felt unusually quiet. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed softer than normal. I kept checking the time. 1:47, 1:53, 1:58. As 2 o'clock approached, the familiar anxiety returned. Then it happened. Knock, knock. The sound echoed through the house exactly as it always had. For a moment, I remained frozen. Then something happened that had never happened before. A whisper. The sound came from outside the front door. It was faint. So faint that I initially thought I imagined it. I held my breath and listened. The whisper came again. A low voice speaking words I couldn't understand. The tone sounded calm, almost conversational, as though someone was standing inches from the door, talking quietly to themselves. Every hair on my arm stood up. I slowly rose from the chair. The whisper continued for several seconds before stopping completely. The silence that followed felt unbearable. I stepped toward the door, one careful step at a time. The house creaked softly beneath my feet. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. When I finally reached the door, I leaned forward and looked through the peephole. Darkness. Nothing else. The porch light should have illuminated the entire entrance. Instead, all I saw was darkness filling the tiny circular lens. It was as if something was blocking the view. I pulled back instinctively. Several seconds passed before I forced myself to look again. This time the porch appeared completely empty. No person, no movement, nothing. I opened the door almost immediately afterward. The porch was deserted. The front yard was empty. The street beyond remained silent, just like every other night. Eventually I went back inside. I didn't sleep. Instead, I waited until sunrise and began reviewing the camera footage. The front camera had disconnected at its usual time. That part didn't surprise me. What surprised me was footage from a side-angle camera. The signal on that camera returned slightly earlier than the others, only by a few seconds, but it was enough. When I reached the relevant timestamp, I paused the recording. Someone was standing beside my front door, not in front of it, beside it, pressed close against the wall where the peephole couldn't see them. The figure remained completely motionless. I watched the footage repeatedly. The person never knocked, not once. Their arms never moved. Their hands remained at their sides, yet the 3 knocks had clearly echoed through the house. The whisper had happened. I had heard both. The recording ended seconds later when the figure stepped out of frame. That was the last footage I ever captured. A few weeks later, I moved out. To this day, I still don't know who stood outside my door at 2 o'clock every morning. And what unsettles me most is knowing they weren't the one making the knocks. Story 2. Room 17, a few years ago. I was driving across the state for work and ended up stopping at a roadside motel that I wish I had never seen. The trip itself had been uneventful. I had spent most of the day on long stretches of highway surrounded by fields and small towns. By the time the sun went down, I still had several hours left before reaching my destination. I was exhausted. Rather than continue driving half asleep, I decided to stop for the night. The motel appeared just off the highway beside an old gas station. Its faded sign buzzed weakly in the darkness, with several letters no longer working. From a distance, the place looked worn but functional. I pulled into the parking lot and immediately noticed how empty it was. There were only 3 vehicles parked outside. For a motel that size, that seemed unusual. Still, it was late, and I wasn't looking for anything fancy. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The lobby was small and dimly lit. An older man stood behind the counter reading a newspaper. He looked up as I entered, and for a moment he seemed surprised to see me. I asked if they had any rooms available. Plenty, he said. His answer felt strange. Most motel owners would probably sound pleased to get another customer. Instead, he sounded hesitant. While he typed information into his computer, I noticed security monitors mounted behind the desk. Several camera feeds showed empty hallways and vacant parking areas. The manager barely looked at me while preparing the room key. Then he paused. His eyes moved to the screen. Something about his expression changed. Not fear exactly, more like discomfort. "You'll be in room 17, he said. The words came out reluctantly. I remember joking that he made it sound like bad news. He forced a smile, but didn't laugh. "Just a room," he replied. I took the key and headed outside. Room 17 was located in a side wing of the property separated from the main building by a narrow walkway. As I approached, I noticed something that immediately felt odd. Several windows farther down the wing were covered with plywood, not broken, boarded. The boards looked old, as though they had been there for years. I slowed down and stared at them for a moment. The rest of the motel looked neglected but operational. That section looked abandoned. The uneasy feeling stayed with me as I unlocked my room. When I stepped inside, everything appeared normal enough. Yet while unpacking my overnight bag, I found myself glancing out the window repeatedly. The motel was too quiet, too empty, and despite seeing almost nobody on the property, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were more people there than I was supposed to notice. At the time, I assumed it was just fatigue. By the next night, I knew it wasn't. The first knock at 2 a.m., I fell asleep faster than I expected. The drive had worn me out, and despite the strange atmosphere of the motel, exhaustion eventually overpowered my curiosity. The room itself wasn't particularly comfortable, but it was clean enough. The air conditioner rattled occasionally, and the mattress felt older than it looked, yet neither bothered me for long. At some point during the night, I woke suddenly. For a few seconds, I didn't know why. The room was dark, except for a faint orange glow leaking through the curtains from the parking lot lights outside. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it. Knock, knock. 3 slow knocks struck the motel door. The sound wasn't aggressive. It wasn't someone pounding for help or trying to force their way inside. It sounded deliberate, measured, almost patient. I rolled over and checked my phone. 2 a.m. At the time, that detail meant nothing to me. I assumed another guest had the wrong room. Maybe someone had been drinking. Maybe they were looking for a friend. The motel seemed old enough that room numbers could easily be confusing at night. I waited for another knock. None came. The silence returned immediately. For several moments, I stayed in bed, expecting the person outside to say something. Nothing. No voice. No footsteps. No sound at all. That was what finally convinced me to get up. I slipped out of bed and walked quietly toward the window beside the door. The curtain covered most of the glass, allowing only a narrow gap near the edge. I carefully pulled it back and looked outside. The walkway was empty. No person stood near the door. No one was walking away. No one was standing near the neighboring rooms. The entire wing appeared deserted. I frowned and glanced toward the parking lot. Only a handful of vehicles sat beneath the lights. Their dark silhouettes remained perfectly still. The rest of the property looked silent. Even the highway noise seemed distant. I stood there for nearly a minute. Nothing moved. Eventually, I opened the door and stepped outside. The cool night air hit me immediately. The concrete walkway stretched in both directions beneath dim exterior lights. Every room door was closed. The boarded windows farther down the building looked even stranger in the darkness. I found myself staring at them longer than necessary. The plywood reflected the light in a dull gray color, making that section of the motel appear abandoned. A brief thought crossed my mind. Maybe someone had knocked on the wrong door and already gone back to their room? That explanation seemed reasonable enough. I walked a short distance in both directions and listened. Nothing. No conversations, no televisions. No footsteps. Just silence. The motel felt strangely empty. Still, I wasn't frightened, only confused. After a few minutes, I returned to my room and locked the door. I checked my phone one last time before climbing back into bed. 2:06 a.m. The entire incident already felt insignificant. One of those minor events that seems strange in the moment, but is forgotten by morning. As I settled beneath the blankets, I remember thinking that I was probably overanalyzing it because of the motel's atmosphere. Within minutes, I was asleep again. What I didn't know was that the knocking wasn't random. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't finished with me. The following night, at exactly the same time, I would hear it again. Nobody uses that hallway the next morning. The knocking felt less important than it had during the night. Daylight has a way of doing that. What seems unsettling at 2 in the morning often feels completely reasonable after breakfast. I checked out of my room briefly to grab coffee from a convenience store across the road and spent most of the morning convincing myself that someone had simply gone to the wrong door. The explanation wasn't perfect, but it was good enough, at least until I saw the motel manager again. He was standing behind the front desk when I walked into the lobby later that afternoon. The place looked just as empty as it had the night before. No guests waited in line. No employees moved through the building. Just the manager sitting behind the counter with a small television playing quietly nearby. I wasn't planning to mention the knocking, but the question slipped out anyway. Did somebody come looking for room 17 last night? The manager looked up immediately. For a second, I thought he hadn't heard me correctly. Then his expression changed. The same uncomfortable look I had noticed when he handed me the key. "What do you mean?" he asked. I explained what happened. 3 knocks at the door around 2 a.m. Nobody outside when I checked. Nobody visible anywhere nearby. As I spoke, he became noticeably tense. His eyes briefly shifted toward the security monitors mounted behind the desk. Then he looked back at me. There shouldn't have been anyone there. The answer came too quickly. "What do you mean?" I asked. He hesitated. Nobody should have been outside that room that late. Something about his tone bothered me. It sounded less like reassurance and more like concern. I waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. Instead, he asked if I had actually seen someone. When I told him no, he seemed relieved. The entire conversation lasted less than a minute before he found an excuse to end it. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he wanted to admit. The encounter stayed in my mind for the rest of the afternoon. By evening, I found myself paying closer attention to the property. The motel still felt unusually empty. A few guests came and went, but nowhere near enough to justify the number of available rooms. That night, while getting ice from a machine near the main building, I ended up talking to another guest. He looked to be in his 40s and mentioned he had been staying there periodically for work over the past several years. Our conversation started casually. Weather, travel, road construction, normal small talk. Then I mentioned staying in room 17. His reaction was subtle, but immediate. "That wing?" he asked. I nodded. He stared at me for a moment. "I didn't think they still rented rooms over there." I laughed, assuming he was joking. He didn't laugh back. "What do you mean?" I asked. He shrugged. "Most people stay in the main section." "Why?" "What?" Another shrug. "Nobody uses that hallway anymore." The statement felt strange enough on its own. What made it worse was the fact that he offered no further explanation. A few moments later, he changed the subject entirely. The conversation ended shortly afterward. As I walked back toward my room, I found myself looking more carefully at the building. That was when I noticed the cameras. There were several security cameras positioned around the motel. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual about that. Then I realized something. Most parking areas had only one camera. Some sections had none. Yet near room 17, there were multiple cameras. One pointed directly down the hallway. Another faced the entrance to my room. A third covered the area near the boarded windows farther down the building. It wasn't normal security coverage. It looked focused, intentional, as though someone considered that specific part of the property more important than the rest. I stopped walking and stared at them for several seconds. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. The manager's reaction, the other guests' comment, the boarded windows, the cameras. Individually, none of it proved anything. Together, they made me feel like I had walked into the middle of a situation everyone else already understood. And later that night, when the clock approached 2 a.m., I found myself waiting for the knock instead of sleeping. Following the sound by the third night, curiosity had replaced caution. I should have ignored the knocking. Looking back, that would have been the sensible thing to do. Instead, I found myself lying awake in bed, staring at the clock and waiting. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the digital display on the nightstand. 1:57 a.m., 1:58, 1:59. I listened carefully. The motel seemed completely silent, and the knocking came. Knock, knock, knock. The sound struck the door with the same slow rhythm I had heard before. This time I reacted immediately. I was already out of bed before the final knock faded. Crossing the room in a few quick steps, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. At first I thought nobody was there, then I saw a movement. At the far end of the hallway, near the section with the boarded windows, someone turned a corner and disappeared from view. The figure moved quickly, too quickly for me to identify. All I caught was the impression of a person wearing dark clothing. For a brief moment, I stood frozen. Finally, after 2 nights, I had actually seen someone. Without thinking, I stepped outside and started after them. The air felt colder than it had on previous nights. The walkway lights cast long shadows across the concrete, creating dark spaces between pools of yellow light. I moved at a fast pace, expecting to reach the corner within seconds. Instead, something felt wrong almost immediately. The hallway seemed longer. I know how ridiculous that sounds. I had walked that same route multiple times since arriving, yet now the distance somehow felt stretched. The boarded windows appeared farther away than I remembered. The corner where the figure disappeared never seemed to get any closer. I slowed down. For the first time, uncertainty crept into my mind. The motel looked different at night, not dramatically different. It's just enough to make familiar things feel unfamiliar. The further I walked, the quieter everything became. Even the distant highway noise seemed to vanish. The only sound was the soft scrape of my shoes against the concrete. Then I noticed the doors. Several room doors stood slightly open, just only an inch or two, just enough to reveal darkness inside. I stopped and stared. I was certain those doors had been closed earlier. The sight immediately made me uncomfortable. An open motel room at 2 a.m. isn't necessarily strange. Several open doors in an almost empty wing felt different. I kept moving. As I passed one of the rooms, I glanced inside. The room appeared vacant. No luggage, no lights, no signs of occupancy. The next room looked the same. Then I reached another doorway. This one was different. Light glowed softly inside. Not bright enough to illuminate the hallway, but bright enough to reveal part of the room. I could see a chair, a suitcase, television screen flickering silently. Someone was staying there. I stopped walking. The manager had practically implied that nobody used this section anymore. The other guest had said the same thing, yet that room was clearly occupied. I considered knocking. As soon as the thought entered my mind, I dismissed it. Something about the atmosphere felt wrong. The room looked normal. Everything around it didn't. I continued toward the corner where the figure had disappeared. The hallway remained empty. No footsteps, no voices, no movement. Yes. Eventually, I reached the end. Nobody was there. The corner opened into a small side area beside the building, empty. The figure had vanished. I turned slowly, trying to make sense of it. That was when I heard the sound. Knock, knock. Knock. 3 slow knocks. Behind me, my entire body locked up. The sound had come from somewhere farther back along the hallway, from the direction I had just walked. For several seconds, I simply stood there staring into the darkness. The knocks were identical to the ones that had brought me outside. The same rhythm, the same spacing, the same deliberate pace. Yet this time, there was no door near me, no visible person. Nothing that could explain where the sound originated. A chill ran through me as I realized something. Whatever I had been following might never have been ahead of me at all. And for the first time since arriving at the motel, I seriously considered turning around and leaving before morning. The occupant of room 21, the sound of the second knocking stayed with me for several minutes. I considered returning directly to my room. Every instinct told me that would be the smart decision. Instead, I continued down the hallway. Curiosity can be a powerful thing, especially when you're convinced that answers are only a few steps away. Moved slowly now, paying attention to every doorway. Most remained slightly open, most appeared empty. The hallway itself felt colder than before. Eventually, I noticed a room number mounted beside one of the doors. The door stood wider open than the others. For some reason, seeing it sent a wave of unease through me. I approached carefully. The room beyond looked dark and abandoned. At first glance, it seemed obvious that nobody had stayed there for a very long time. Dust covered nearly every visible surface. The furniture looked neglected. A thin layer of dirt coated the television stand and dresser. One curtain hung partially off its rail. The room felt forgotten. I stepped inside. The air smelled stale. Not unpleasant exactly, just old, like a space that had remained closed for years. Then I noticed the floor. A series of footprints crossed the dust. Fresh footprints. They were impossible to miss. The dust around them remained undisturbed, making each print stand out clearly. Someone had walked through the room recently, very recently. I followed the trail with my eyes. The prints led directly toward the window. My pulse quickened. For the first time all night, I felt certain I was about to find an explanation. I crossed the room and looked outside. The view overlooked part of the motel parking lot and the wing where my room was located. For a moment, everything appeared normal. Then I saw the figure. Someone stood near room 17, motionless, watching. The distance made details impossible to identify. I couldn't tell whether it was a man or woman. Couldn't make out clothing or facial features. All I knew was that somebody was standing near my room. My room. The realization hit me instantly. Without thinking, I rushed from room 21 and sprinted back through the hallway. My footsteps echoed loudly against the concrete. I expected the figure to still be there when I arrived. Expected answers. Instead, the area outside room 17 was completely empty. No person, no movement, nothing. The parking lot remained silent beneath the lights. I searched the immediate area for several minutes before finally giving up. By morning, I was exhausted and frustrated. Before checking out, I confronted the manager one final time. This time I told him everything. The knocking, the figure, room 21, the footprints. As I spoke, he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he remained silent for several seconds. Then he sighed heavily. The expression on his face looked more tired than surprised. Finally, he admitted something. I wasn't the first guest to report those experiences. Several people had described nearly identical events over the years. The knocking, the figure, the hallway, even room 21. When I asked him who was responsible, he simply shook his head. "I wish I knew," he said. Then he looked toward the security monitors and added something that has stayed with me ever since. "Most people leave after the second night. I checked out less than an hour later. To this day, I still don't know who I saw standing outside room 17. Story 3. The farmhouse road. The farmhouse came into my life because of a relative I barely knew. When my great-uncle passed away, I was unexpectedly named in his will. I didn't inherit much money, but I inherited the property he had lived on for most of his life. I considered selling it. The house sat in a remote rural area nearly an hour from the nearest town. The surrounding land stretched 4 acres in every direction, broken only by fields, patches of woodland, and an occasional gravel road. The nearest neighbor lived several miles away. For most people, that level of isolation would have been a disadvantage. For me, it sounded perfect. I had spent years living in crowded cities and noisy apartment buildings. The idea of having space and silence felt appealing. A month later, I moved in. The farmhouse was old but sturdy. It creaked occasionally when temperatures changed, and some parts of the structure clearly showed their age, but overall it was comfortable. More importantly, it was peaceful. Days passed quietly. Mornings were filled with birdsong and distant wind moving through the fields. Evenings brought spectacular sunsets that seemed to stretch endlessly across the horizon. At night, the darkness was unlike anything I had experienced before. Without city lights, the landscape disappeared completely after sunset. The stars looked brighter than I thought possible. The silence felt almost unreal. For the first few weeks, I loved it. I settled into a routine and began making plans to renovate parts of the property. Whatever strange stories people associated with old farmhouses, I wasn't interested in them. To me, it was simply a house. That changed one night in early autumn. I woke suddenly to the sound of knocking. Knock, knock, knock. The noise echoed through the house. I rolled over and checked the clock beside my bed. 2 a.m., the time barely registered. My immediate assumption was that somebody needed help. The area around the property was rural enough that car trouble wasn't uncommon. Travelers occasionally got lost on the back roads, especially after dark. I sat up and listened. The silence that followed seemed normal. Nothing about the situation felt threatening. If anything, I felt concerned for whoever might be standing outside. The night air was cold, and the nearest gas station was miles away. I got out of bed, slipped on my shoes, and headed downstairs. As I moved through the dark farmhouse, I remember thinking how strange it was that anyone would be visiting at that hour. Still, there was a reasonable explanation. At least that's what I believed as I approached the front door. I had no idea that those 3 knocks would become the beginning of something I would never fully understand. No car, no footprints. When I reached the front door that first night, I didn't hesitate. I unlocked it, pulled it open, and stepped onto the porch, expecting to find a stranded driver or someone asking for directions. Instead, I found nothing. The property stretched out before me beneath a pale moonlit sky. The fields surrounding the farmhouse looked silver in the darkness, and a light breeze moved through the tall grass beyond the fence line. Nobody stood on the porch. Nobody stood in the yard. Nobody was walking up the long gravel driveway. At first, I assumed whoever had knocked must have already left. That explanation lasted only a few seconds. Then I looked at the driveway. A vehicle couldn't reach the house without leaving tracks. The gravel road leading from the main highway ran directly to the property entrance. Any car, truck, or motorcycle would have disturbed the surface. There were no fresh tire marks. None. The driveway looked completely untouched. I remember standing there staring at it for several moments. The realization made no sense. If someone had arrived on foot, there should have been footprints. The ground around the house was soft from recent rain. Even my own footprints were clearly visible near the porch. Yet I couldn't find any others. Not a single print leading toward the house. Not a single print leading away from it. Eventually, I convinced myself there had to be an explanation I wasn't seeing. Maybe I had misheard the sound. Maybe an old section of the house had settled and produced a noise that resembled knocking. The theory wasn't particularly convincing, but it was enough to help me get back to sleep. The next morning, everything felt less significant. The farmhouse looked peaceful again. Sunlight filled the kitchen windows. Fields appeared calm and ordinary. For most of the day, I barely thought about the incident. Then the following night arrived. At exactly 2 a.m., the knocking returned. Knock, knock. The sound was identical. 3 slow knocks. The same rhythm. The same spacing. This time I moved faster. Within seconds, I was downstairs and opening the front door. Again, nobody was there. The yard remained empty. The driveway remained empty. And once again, there were no signs that anyone had approached the property. By morning, I knew something unusual was happening. I just didn't know what. Later that afternoon, I drove into town for supplies. The community was small enough that everyone seemed familiar with everyone else. While purchasing groceries, I ended up speaking with an older resident who had lived in the area for decades. At some point, I casually mentioned the farmhouse. His expression immediately changed, not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. He asked which property I was referring to, and I told him. He nodded slowly. For a few seconds, he seemed lost in thought. Then I mentioned the knocking. The reaction was immediate. The man's face tightened. His eyes shifted away from mine. Probably kids, he said. The answer sounded forced. I pointed out that the nearest neighbor lived miles away. He didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed his groceries and started preparing to leave. Something about his behavior made me stop him. Has anyone else mentioned it? I asked. The question seemed to make him uncomfortable. For several moments, he simply stood there. Then he shook his head. No. The answer came too quickly. Before I could ask anything else, he turned and walked away. Watched him leave the store. He never looked back. The encounter bothered me for the rest of the drive home. The man had clearly recognized the property. He had clearly reacted to the story. Yet he wanted nothing to do with the conversation. That night, as darkness settled over the fields again, I found myself thinking less about the knocking itself and more about the possibility that somebody else already knew exactly what was causing it. The figure near the tree line, by the time the knocking had happened for the fourth consecutive night, I stopped believing it would resolve itself. Whatever was causing it wasn't random, it wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't going away. The conversation with the local resident continued bothering me as well. His reaction had confirmed something I had already begun to suspect. The farmhouse had a history, maybe not one people openly discussed, but enough of a history that mentioning it made someone visibly uncomfortable. I decided that if I wanted answers, I would have to stop waiting inside the house. So on the fifth night, I went outside before the knocking could happen. At around 1:40 a.m., I grabbed a flashlight, put on a jacket, and walked into the yard. The temperature had dropped significantly after sunset. Cold wind moved across the fields, carrying the smell of damp soil and distant vegetation. The farmhouse stood behind me, its windows glowing softly against the darkness. Beyond the property, the world seemed to disappear into shadow. I positioned myself near the front fence where I could watch both the house and the surrounding land. Then I waited. The minutes passed slowly. Checked my phone repeatedly. 1:48, 1:52, 1:56, nothing moved. But the fields remained silent. The darkness beyond the property looked completely empty. For a while, I started feeling foolish. Standing alone in the middle of the night waiting for something unexplained to happen wasn't exactly rational behavior. Then I noticed it. At first I thought it was a tree, a darker shape among the darkness. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. Something was standing near the tree line. The woods began several hundred feet beyond the edge of the property. During the day, the distance seemed insignificant. At night, it felt enormous. The silhouette stood motionless where the fields met the trees, human-shaped, tall, perfectly still. I raised my flashlight instinctively. The beam didn't reach far enough. The figure remained a distant outline against the darkness. My stomach tightened. For several seconds, I considered walking toward it. I didn't. Something about the way it stood there felt wrong. Most people shift their weight. They move their arms, they adjust their posture. This figure did nothing. It looked less like a person standing naturally, and more like someone frozen in place. I kept watching. The figure never moved. Not once. Minutes passed. The silhouette remained exactly where it was. Then I checked the time. 1:59 a.m. I focused entirely on the distant shape. If that person had been responsible for the knocking, I was finally going to witness it. The clock on my phone changed. 2 a.m. And immediately I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from behind me, from the farmhouse. Every muscle in my body tensed. I spun around. The front porch stood illuminated beneath the exterior light. The house looked completely normal, yet the knocking had clearly come from the front door. I was certain of it. For several seconds, I simply stared. Then I turned back toward the tree line. The figure was still there, motionless, exactly where it had been before. A chill spread through me. The distance made it impossible. No person could have traveled from the woods to the house and back in that amount of time. Not without me seeing them. I stood frozen between the two locations, farmhouse behind me, the figure ahead of me. Neither made sense. My flashlight felt heavier in my hand. The cold wind suddenly seemed stronger. For the first time since the knocking began, I realized I might have been asking the wrong question. I had spent days trying to identify who was knocking, standing there in the darkness. I began wondering if the thing near the tree line and the thing at the front door were not the same at all. And somehow, that possibility frightened me far more than anything I had considered before. Something in the fields after seeing the figure near the tree line, the atmosphere around the farmhouse changed completely. Or maybe it had always been that way and I was only noticing it now. Either way, the property no longer felt peaceful. The silence I had once enjoyed began to feel unnatural. Every evening as darkness settled over the fields, I found myself listening for sounds that hadn't seemed important before. At first it was subtle, a rustling noise somewhere beyond the fence, movement in tall grass after midnight, the occasional sound of something crossing the fields when no vehicles or people should have been nearby. Whenever I investigated, I found nothing. No footprints, no damaged fencing, no evidence that anyone had been there. Yet the sounds continued. Some nights they lasted only a few seconds.
Other nights, yes.
They seemed to circle the property for hours. The livestock noticed it too. I only kept a small number of animals, but their behavior became impossible to ignore. The horses grew restless after dark. Several times I found them standing at the far edge of their enclosure, staring toward the same distant section of woods where I had seen the silhouette. They rarely made noise. They simply watched, as though they were waiting for something. The chickens became equally strange. Normally, they settled down quickly after sunset. Now they occasionally erupted into sudden bursts of agitation during the middle of the night. The first few times it happened, I rushed outside expecting to find a predator. There was never anything there. No foxes, no coyotes, nothing. Only frightened animals and empty darkness. Then other things started happening. Small things. Easy things to dismiss individually. A shovel I left near the barn would appear several yards away the next morning. A bucket placed beside a fence post would turn up near the house. Once I found a wheelbarrow positioned in the middle of the driveway, despite clearly remembering leaving it behind the barn. I repeatedly told myself I must be forgetting where I put things. That explanation became harder to believe over time. The incidents happened too often, always after nights when the knocking occurred. One rainy evening, while searching the attic for old renovation documents, I discovered something unexpected. A wooden box hidden beneath a pile of blankets. Inside were several notebooks. Most were worn and discolored with age. At first, I assumed they contained financial records or maintenance notes from previous owners. Instead, they appeared to be journals. The earliest entries dated back decades. Curious, I began reading. What I found unsettled me immediately. The writer described hearing knocks at the front door during the middle of the night. 3 knocks. Always after 2 a.m. My pulse quickened as I turned the pages. Entry after entry described experiences that mirrored my own. Strange sounds in the fields, livestock behaving nervously, objects appearing in different locations, the feeling of being watched from a distance. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Whoever had written the journals had experienced the same events long before I arrived. I spent hours reading. The entries became increasingly detailed as time passed. The writer grew obsessed with identifying the source of the knocking. Several pages described watching the tree line. Others mentioned seeing a distant figure near the woods. The descriptions matched what I had witnessed almost exactly. Then the journal reached its final section. The handwriting became less steady. Entries grew shorter, more urgent. One page immediately caught my attention. It contained only a few sentences. The writer claimed they had finally seen who was responsible. Not heard, not suspected, seen. My heart raced as I turned the page. The next sheet was missing. Torn cleanly from the notebook. I checked again and again. The page simply wasn't there. The journal continued afterward for only 2 more brief entries before ending completely. No explanation. No conclusion. Nothing. Whoever wrote it never recorded another word. I sat alone in the attic, staring at the damaged notebook. The answer I had been searching for seemed closer than ever. Somewhere on that missing page was the one thing I wanted most. The identity of whoever had been knocking. And somehow, after surviving decades inside that attic, it was the only page that had disappeared. 2 a.m., one final time finding the journals changed something in me. For weeks I had been searching for explanations, had checked the fields, watched the tree line, inspected the property, and listened to every strange sound that emerged from the darkness. The journals confirmed I wasn't imagining any of it. Someone else had experienced the same events. Someone else had become obsessed with the knocking. Someone else had apparently discovered the answer. The missing page bothered me more than anything. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Eventually I decided there was only one thing left to do. I would answer the knocking. Not after it happened. Not minutes later, immediately. If something wanted my attention badly enough to appear every night, I was going to confront it. The following evening felt unusually quiet. The animals settled earlier than normal. The wind died down shortly after sunset. Even the distant sounds from the fields seemed absent. It felt as though the entire property was waiting. Around midnight, I turned off every light in the farmhouse except a single lamp near the front entrance. Then I sat in a chair facing the door. Hours passed slowly. I remember checking the clock repeatedly. 1:42, 1:51, 1:57. The silence became almost unbearable. As 2 o'clock approached, I moved closer to the door. My hand rested on the handle. I was determined not to hesitate. The digital clock changed. 2 a.m. Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed through the house. Before the final knock fully faded, I pulled the door open. The porch stood empty. Nobody was there. No figure. No traveler. No stranger standing in the yard. The fields stretched into darkness exactly as they had every other night. I stepped onto the porch. Nothing moved. The driveway remained empty. The tree line remained distant and silent. For several seconds, I simply stared. Then it happened. Knock. A single knock. Behind me, the sound came from somewhere inside the farmhouse. Every muscle in my body locked instantly. I turned slowly toward the open doorway. The interior of the house looked unchanged. The lamp near the entrance still glowed softly. The hallway beyond remained dark, yet the knock had clearly come from within. Not from the front door, not from outside, from somewhere deeper inside the house. A cold feeling spread through my chest. For the first time since the entire ordeal began, I felt genuine fear. The realization hit me all at once. For weeks I had assumed something outside wanted to get in. I'd never considered the possibility that whatever was responsible might already be inside. I stood frozen on the porch for what felt like several minutes. Nothing else happened. No footsteps. No voices. No additional knocks. Just silence. The next morning, I began making plans to leave. Within a month, I had moved out completely. I never spent another night in that farmhouse. Years passed. Life moved on. Eventually, the property was abandoned. The fields grew over. The house slowly fell into disrepair. Then, several years later, I found myself driving through the area again. Curiosity got the better of me. I took the old road and passed the property one final time. The farmhouse looked exactly as abandoned as I expected. Broken fencing, overgrown grass, dark windows. I was already driving past when something caught my eye. Faint light upstairs. In one of the second-floor windows, I slowed the car. The light remained visible for only a moment before disappearing. I never stopped to investigate. I never returned. And to this day, I still don't know who or what was knocking at 2 o'clock in the morning.